Committee will come to order. Before we begin today's hearing, I want to just say that if we take a minute just to be thinking and praying for the families and loved ones of the man that was killed at the Martin Coal Mine Prep Plant demolition site in Martin County, Kentucky this week, and the workers are still trapped somewhere beneath the rubble that we haven't been able to locate yet. And it's a tragic reminder of the dangers our coal communities face and the sacrifices they make to power our nation. In this case, the sacrifices continue even after this facility has been closed. I also want to express my frustration that just this morning, the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management announced that it will again delay the Gulf of Mexico lease sale 261, despite the director testifying before this committee 1 week ago that all systems are go to hold the lease sale on November the 8th. BOEM is once again blaming the courts for delaying the sale, but the delays are entirely the administration's fault. The Department of the Interior was so eager to meet the demands of environmental groups to restrict the sale that it bypassed important legal requirements, leading to this litigation. Moving to today's topic that we're going to be hearing about the examine opportunities and challenges our country has deploying carbon capture, utilization, and sequestration, or CCUS, and direct air capture, or DAC. Both of these critical technologies have received significant bipartisan support from Congress in recent years, and that should come as no surprise, as they will play a vital role in protecting American energy security, keeping electricity reliable, and creating jobs here at home while we reduce our emissions in decades to come. Between the improvements we made to the 45Q tax credit in the Inflation Reduction Act and the funding that we included for deployment and demonstration in the bipartisan infrastructure law, CCUS and DAC are now on the rise. In the IRA, we increased the value of the 45Q tax credit from $50 a ton to $85 for carbon capture and sequestering, from $35 to $60 per ton for carbon captured and utilized, and more than double the credit for direct air capture because that technology is currently more expensive. These IRA provisions built off of earlier improvements to 45Q that our colleague Sandra Brasso spearheaded and I supported. In the IRA, we made important changes to the 45Q proposal in the BBB bill, which would have excluded many of our dispatchable coal and natural gas power plants from continuing to use the credit. Furthermore, our committee's portion of the bipartisan infrastructure law included over $10 billion in DOE programs to commercialize large CCUS and DAC projects. We spent decades researching and proving CCUS technologies work. The program in the IRA and infrastructure law were intended to accelerate the full-scale deployment of them. And this legislation is attracting unprecedented private sector investment. CCUS and DAC developers have submitted more than 120 applications to EPA for Class 6 well permits to sequester carbon since the IRA passed there, and there are 169 total pending applications. You can see where we are, and not one approval has been made by the Biden administration. The current administration claims to be supportive of carbon capture, just as Congress has been. The issue, a report in June 2021 was stated, the administration is committed to accelerating the responsible development and deployment of CCUS to make it a widely available, increasingly cost-effective, and rapidly scalable climate solution. The same report also argues that if the United States is to achieve its climate goals, research suggests that CCUS deployment should increase tenfold over the next decade. But it's hard for me to square this administration's own report with its actions nearly 2.5 years after that report came out. Not a single Class 6 well has been approved. The chart behind me shows the backlog. Many of these applications have been pending for years. At the same time, the administration is more than happy to mandate widespread deployment of carbon capture on gas and coal-fired power plants. All we want is a level playing field, just a fair, level playing field. So let me be clear, issuing a mandate to use carbon capture on power plants while withholding Class 6 well approvals is nothing more than a mandate to shut down all of our dispatchable coal and gas power plants prematurely. And the Supreme Court has been clear that Congress has not given EPA the authority to mandate a transition of our generation fleet. I'm disappointed that the talk from the administration seems to be completely out of step with their inaction. However, I'm optimistic that as more states, including West Virginia, Louisiana, and Texas, are granted primacy from EPA to approve Class 6 wells themselves, the backlog will decline, and we will really scale up carbon capture sequestration. I'm also concerned that while the bipartisan infrastructure law passed more than 2 years ago, much of the CCUS funding has yet to go out the door. As we wait for awards on the carbon capture large-scale pilot programs, financial assistance for CO2 pipelines, and other programs, the clock is ticking to deploy this technology and build out infrastructure necessary to do so. I'm glad we have witnesses joining us from the EPA and DOE to discuss how to get these important permitting and financial assistance programs back on track. Earlier this week, the EFI Foundation, which led by former Secretary of Energy Moniz, released a report highlighting the potential infrastructure needed to meet the EPA's proposed power plant regulations. In fact, it was released on Halloween, which is fitting, because it really presents a scary picture. As they explain, permitting CCS is a highly uncertain process that can take years in ideal conditions because the CCS value chain covers multiple sectors and there's little federal coordination. As one example, the report predicts that we may need to increase the total miles of CO2 pipelines from 5,000 to over 50,000, which is a 1,000% increase in just over a decade. The report specifically notes that the current Class 6 well and NEPA permitting processes call into serious question the feasibility of EPA's power plant proposal. I've already expressed my grave concern with the EPA's power plant proposal, highlighting its threat to electric reliability and energy security, and EFI's analyst just adds to my concerns. If we're going to recognize the economic, energy security, and environmental benefits from CCUS and DAC, it will require much more coordination from the federal government. CCUS is also essential for applications much broader than coal or gas power plants. Hydrogen projects may rely on CCUS to realize the incentives for clean hydrogen production that we included in the infrastructure law and the IRA. Steel and cement companies will look to CCUS to decarbonize their manufacturing to compete in global markets. DOE's own analysis found that widespread deployment of carbon capture and removal technologies could add nearly $1.5 trillion to the economy by 2050. We are at an inflection point. We are really at an inflection point. Historic investment from Congress is meeting scientific innovation to deploy cutting-edge technologies and infrastructure. However, regulatory and permitting uncertainty could cause this tremendous opportunity to slip right through our fingers. This is an opportunity not just for American companies here at home, but for us to lead the world in the energy economy of the future. And it's also an opportunity to learn from our partners abroad. For example, our allies in Norway are ahead of us sequestering carbon in subsea formations. They are already sequestering carbon at depths of more than 3,000 feet beneath the seafloor and are pursuing new projects beyond 8,000 feet. Yet here in the U.S., we are a year behind schedule, even issuing the requirements to apply for carbon sequestration permits on our outer continental shelf, a permitting program that was required by the infrastructure law. The U.S. has led the world in developing both CCUS and DAC, and foregoing that leadership because of government inaction is unconscionable. Its success is crucial to our energy security, our economy, and our environment. I hope today's hearing will shed some light on what else is needed to ensure deployment of these critical technologies, and look forward to continuing to work with the ranking member and all members of this committee to that end. With that, I look forward to an engaging discussion today with our panel of distinguished witnesses, and I'll turn it over to my ranking member and friend, Senator Barrasso, to give his opening remarks.
Well, thanks so much, Mr. Chairman. And before giving the opening statements, I want to address, like you did, the news from this morning, where just last week, the director of the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, Elizabeth Klein, sat at this table, at that seat, and she told the committee, all systems are go for Lease Sale 261. She went on to say, we don't see anything in the way of holding that sale. Well, she lied to the committee, because today, this very morning, she postponed the sale indefinitely. This administration is becoming even more brazen in its disregard for the law of the land and for the members of this committee, and it is shameful. So, Mr. Chairman, I want to thank you for holding today's very important hearing. President Biden has made it clear that he wants to eliminate the production and the use of coal in the United States. Just last year, the president said, quote, "We're going to be shutting these coal plants down all across America and having wind and solar," end quote. Well, the Biden administration has followed through on this reckless promise. The Biden administration has blocked coal leasing on federal lands. It has slow-walked mining permits. It has proposed emissions regulations aimed at shuttering coal-fired power plants. It is attempting to kill coal by 1,000 cuts. This is a recipe for disaster for our country and for our citizens. According to the Department of Energy's Energy Information Administration, coal will be an important part of our energy mix for decades to come. It makes no sense to block American coal production and then import coal from other countries. There's a good reason that coal will be needed well into the future. In contrast to wind and solar, coal-fired plants can provide dispatchable power. That is, they can provide electricity 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. In the last 6 months, this committee has received testimony from representatives of FERC, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, and NERC, the North American Electric Reliability Corporation. So we're talking about regulations as well as reliability. They all told us that the premature retirement of dispatchable generation, which includes coal, they all say it jeopardizes our nation's electric reliability. Eliminating this generation risks putting Americans in the dark and keeping the electric vehicles that they want to force on the American public parked and on empty. Instead of elimination, we should encourage innovation. Wyoming is doing just that. The Integrated Test Center in Gillette, Wyoming is a shining example of an innovative public-private partnership. It develops carbon capture, utilization, and storage technologies in real-world conditions. The University of Wyoming has also been at the cutting edge of research and development of carbon capture, utilization, and sequestration. It sponsored one of the original proposals picked to participate in the Department of Energy's Carbon Safe program. The program aims to develop geologic storage sites to store 50 million metric tons of carbon dioxide. The university was recently awarded additional funding under the program. This funding will be used to advance a carbon capture and storage hub in the greater Green River Basin. It will do this with carbon dioxide derived from trona mining and direct air capture. Despite advances in carbon capture technology, challenges remain. For example, new carbon dioxide pipelines are needed to transport the carbon dioxide. And there is uncertainty around the rules that govern how to store carbon dioxide on federal land. Now, I believe we can overcome these challenges. More difficult are the ideological obstacles. Some environmental extremists don't want to see carbon capture move forward. To them, carbon emissions are not simply the problem. To them, coal, oil, and natural gas are the problem. The Environmental Protection Agency is under immense pressure from extremists to deny states the authority to permit carbon dioxide injection wells. Opponents of carbon capture fear that states would actually permit these projects in a timely manner. Well, the EPA appears to have buckled under that pressure from the extremist groups, because only 2 states have the authority at this point to permit these wells, my home state of Wyoming and Senator Hovind's home state of North Dakota. Projects in other states must get a permit from the EPA. Currently, 163 wells are seeking approval from the EPA in a process that can take up to 6 years. Meanwhile, the EPA is pushing extreme air regulations that require the widespread use of carbon capture technology long before it can be implemented. It appears the EPA's goal is not to help carbon capture technology, but to kill it. If we intend to maintain electric reliability in this country and reduce emissions at the same time, it's critical that we get this right. That means advancing policies that give carbon capture technologies a chance to reach its full potential. So I'm hoping today's hearing, Mr. Chairman, will move us in that direction. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator. As I mentioned, we have a distinguished panel of witnesses with us today, including the Honorable Brad Crabtree, Assistant Secretary for Fossil Energy and Carbon Management at the Department of Energy. We have Mr. Bruno Piggott, Deputy Assistant Administrator for Water at the Environmental Protection Agency. We have Ms. Erin Burns, Executive Director of Carbon 180 and a proud West Virginian. I would like to note that Ms. Burns previously served her home state in my office from 2011 to 2015. She earned her Bachelor of Arts from Carnegie Mellon University. It's always nice to have a fellow West Virginian and former colleague of mine working side by side. Erin, congratulations, and 2 young children, 1 and 3, I understand. That's wonderful. And I'm going to turn to my colleague, Senator Brasso, to introduce our final witness.
Well, thanks, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to welcome Ms. Lily Barkow, who is one of our witnesses today. She has traveled from Cheyenne, Wyoming, to be here with us, and she is an expert on siting underground injection wells for carbon capture and sequestration projects. She has a bachelor's degree in geology from Wichita State University. She then earned a master's degree in environmental sciences and engineering from the Colorado School of Mines. She has served at the Wyoming Department of Environmental Quality since 2006, which were the dates when I was back in the Wyoming State Senate. Lily, thanks so much for being here today, for sharing your expertise with the committee, and I look forward to hearing your testimony. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator. And now we're going to hear from our witnesses with their opening remarks. And Mr. Crabtree, we'll start with you.
Thank you, Chairman Manchin, Ranking Member Barrasso, and members of the committee. I appreciate the opportunity to discuss with you the work being done at the Department of Energy to advance carbon management technologies and infrastructure to meet our energy security and climate goals. It's also an honor to join my colleagues Bruno Piggott of EPA, Aaron Burns of Carbon 180, and Lily Barkow of the Wyoming Department of Environmental Quality. I appreciate the committee's longstanding bipartisan interest, support, and commitment to providing the Department of Energy and the Office of Fossil Energy and Carbon Management with the funding and tools necessary to advance critical carbon management technologies and infrastructure. Thank you for that support. As you know, Mr. Chairman, we have been investing in carbon management technologies for more than 25 years and across 5 presidential administrations. And this longstanding support from both sides of the aisle for this important work has enabled carbon management to emerge into a promising, scalable, and commercially viable decarbonization option in which the U.S. can continue to lead the world in coming decades. Thanks to bipartisan legislation, from annual appropriations to the 2020 Energy Act, bipartisan infrastructure law, bipartisan efforts, as the chairman mentioned, to enhance the 45Q tax credit, and most recently the CHIPS and Science Act, the Department of Energy has been able to deliver a range of critical successes for carbon management. These include over 5,000 miles of CO2 pipeline infrastructure and 13 operating commercial-scale carbon capture projects across multiple industries that collectively capture, safely transport, and permanently store over 20 million metric tons of CO2 annually. This represents more than 1/3 of the 30 commercial-scale projects operating globally at the end of 2022. The past several years of legislative progress enable us to build on this foundation of success and have prompted a significant shift in the commercial outlook for deployment of carbon management projects. Nearly 200 projects have been publicly announced in response to improvements to the 45Q tax credit, a massive increase over today's 13 operating commercial projects. Given the powerful leveraging effect of the infrastructure law investments and the 45Q tax credit, our Office of Fossil Energy Carbon Management, Office of Clean Energy Demonstrations, and Loan Programs Office have been working aggressively on implementation to ensure that federal funding can flow to the highest impact projects as quickly and effectively as possible. DOE's carbon management, research development, demonstration and deployment activities are also evolving alongside this shift in commercial outlook. And our funding opportunities have begun to focus on later stage innovation, including implementation of the infrastructure law funding for pilots, demonstrations, and hubs. We're also expanding our focus to enable carbon capture at a wider range of industrial facilities, often in collaboration with other offices at DOE that are pioneering complementary industrial decarbonization strategies. Additionally, our carbon-negative energy Earthshot is aimed at advancing carbon removal by driving down the cost of that technology over the next decade to less than $100 per metric ton of carbon dioxide removed from the atmosphere. And we've expanded our CO2 conversion program to explore ways to convert waste carbon emissions, both carbon monoxide and CO2, into value-added industrial products that can help decarbonize our built environment and petrochemical and fuel supply chains. All of these advances are important for our domestic priorities, but they are also good news for international carbon management efforts and for America's long-standing global leadership and initiatives to stand up and deploy these technologies around the world. Meanwhile, here at home, DOE recognizes that we simply cannot realize the full deployment potential of the funding, financing, and incentives in recent legislation without broad-based understanding and support from local communities and other stakeholders. To that end, we are including community benefit plan requirements in our funding opportunities to ensure that the recipients of DOE funding create high-quality jobs, protect the environment from unintended pollution, and ensure that projects are sited and operated with significant input from and benefit to local communities. And finally, we're exploring a voluntary responsible carbon management initiative designed to identify and elevate industry best practices and encourage project developers to pursue the highest levels of safety, environmental stewardship, transparency, and community engagement and benefits. Mr. Chairman, thank you again for the community's interest, support, and commitment to providing DOE with the funding and tools necessary to increase the speed and scale of carbon management deployment. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Piggott.
Good morning, Chairman Manchin, Ranking Member Barrasso, and members of the committee. My name is Bruno Piggott. I serve as the Principal Deputy Assistant Administrator for Water at EPA. Thank you for the opportunity to testify before this committee today on the critical topic of carbon capture and storage. Prior to my serving in my current position over the past year and a half, I served in bipartisan administrations for 20 years in a coal state, Indiana, in a variety of roles at the Department of Environmental Management in Indiana, including as its commissioner. That state experience taught me the importance of issuing timely, defensible permits, and I'm committed to doing the same here. The Biden-Harris administration set a goal of reducing greenhouse gas emissions 50% by 2030 and net zero emissions economy-wide by 2050. Carbon capture, utilization, and storage, widely known as CCUS, will be central to achieving those goals. The growth of CCUS is expected to produce between 390,000 and 1.8 million good-paying jobs, especially in those communities that have been most affected by the transition to a net zero economy. CCUS then holds enormous environmental and economic potential. And recognizing that potential, Congress provided historic funding through the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law and Inflation Reduction Act. Thank you for that. CCUS is a proven technology. It's been used for decades. It traps carbon emissions from industrial sources and stores them permanently. EPA's role under the Safe Drinking Water Act is to ensure that these activities do not contaminate our waters. And that's why we issue permits for injecting CO2 in underground wells. These permit requirements protect America's drinking water from contamination and as a result, protect public health. I'd like to talk for a minute about primacy. EPA strongly supports efforts by states to obtain primacy for the Class 6 program. My time in Indiana taught me that states play a key role in our regulatory programs, and we're working hard to grant primacy to states for Class 6, as we have in most of our other permitting programs. We're grateful to Congress for the appropriations we received to grow our state primacy team and for the more than $50 million Congress provided in bipartisan infrastructure law to support primacy activities. EPA is announcing this morning the opening of the application process for those dollars for states. Currently, as indicated, North Dakota and Wyoming have primacy for Class 6, and Louisiana is in the final stages of the application process. Texas, West Virginia, Arizona are all in the pre-application phase, and 20 other states and 2 tribal nations have expressed interest in primacy. We believe this grant program will provide the resources states need to set up these programs. Thank you so much for that funding. Where states have not obtained Class 6 primacy, EPA issues permits. EPA is committed to reviewing the Class 6 applications efficiently. Permit applications are technical documents. They contain information about the geology to ensure the area is free of faults and fractures, the injected CO2 plume to know where that CO2 goes, and specifics about well construction to make sure it's operated in a way that works. We evaluate this information to ensure our source water is protected. Interest in Class 6 wells has grown exponentially over this last year. To meet the increased demand, EPA is using the resources from both Congress and the Federal Permitting Improvement Steering Council to increase our staff of experts to review these permits. Additionally, through interagency agreement with the Department of Energy, We serve many of the applications are being reviewed by the national laboratories the DOE operates to ensure that we review the models appropriately. EPA's goal is to make permit determinations within 24 months after receipt of a complete application. Our job is to ensure all people are fully protected from the adverse environmental and health hazards and have equitable access to a healthy environment. EPA has taken several actions over the last year to fulfill this commitment. Most recently, in August, the agency finalized guidance to provide clear expectations for transparency and community engagement. And these common sense practices will help set clear expectations. EPA and our growing Class 6 team are committed to clear, consistent, speedy issuance of these permits. Thank you for the opportunity to testify.
Thank you. Now we have Ms. Burns.
Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today on the deployment of direct air capture in the United States. I'm Erin Burns, the Executive Director of Carbon 180, an independent nonprofit organization focused on reversing 2 centuries of emissions. I also want to take a moment to say I'm particularly honored to be here today. As Chairman Manchin mentioned, I previously staffed him, my home state senator, when he was a member of this committee. Direct air capture can play an essential role in meeting climate goals through addressing legacy emissions. It can also bring enormous benefits beyond climate, including bolstering American technological leadership and driving economic growth. And those benefits can be realized across the country. Today, the U.S. is the global leader in direct air capture. The majority of DAC companies are headquartered here in the U.S., and while some of the largest companies aren't U.S.-based, they still have their first full-scale deployments planned here. That's because of legislation like the Energy Act, the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, and the Inflation Reduction Act. Today, global DAC capacity is in the tens of thousands of tons. Recently enacted policies, however, are estimated to result in 1 to 8 million tons of DAC deployment by 2030, and by 2035, that figure could be as high as 84 million tons. This deployment can create new jobs and businesses, it can promote market and economic growth, and it can provide long-term wealth-building opportunities. According to an analysis released just this past month, a 500,000-ton direct air capture plant could generate more than 1,200 jobs in construction, engineering, materials, and equipment, and more than 300 jobs in operation and maintenance over the facility's lifetime. 8 million tons of deployment by 2030 would mean up to 24,000 jobs. 84 million tons of deployment by 2035 could mean more than 260,000 direct air capture jobs. To fully realize this economic opportunity, however, we must also invest in domestic supply chains. Around a third of the jobs identified are in supply chains, and direct air capture plants should be built using steel and other materials produced in the U.S. There's also enormous private sector demand for direct air capture that can be unlocked by policy support. Voluntary carbon removal markets are estimated at $10 to $40 billion by 2030. But in that same year, demand for direct air capture is expected to exceed projected supply. Importantly, direct air capture projects, they can be sited in many regions, including those that are navigating an economy impacted by the reduction in production and use of fossil fuels, where workforces have many overlapping skill sets with those required in the construction, operation, and maintenance of a direct air capture facility. Personally, this opportunity on economic growth and wealth creation is one I'm particularly excited about. I'm from Southern West Virginia, an area whose history is deeply interconnected with coal, and I want to see a DAC industry where the wealth created goes into the pockets of those folks who are doing the work, supporting high-paying union jobs and the benefits that come with those jobs. The opportunity for a place like West Virginia to build a new industry that leverages our existing skill sets, that has a long future in a world where markets have a preference already for low and zero carbon industries, is one that I am personally deeply invested in. To make those potential benefits a reality in places across the U.S., however, we're going to need additional policy. My written testimony includes several specific recommendations, but I'd like to highlight 3 in particular. First, one of the most significant barriers to direct air capture deployment today is infrastructure. We need to capture billions of tons of CO2. Those are going to need to be safely and securely stored. The Department of Energy should coordinate with the Environmental Protection Agency to ensure timely and thorough Class 6 review for things like the direct air capture hubs projects, and also provide technical assistance to those projects. We're also really excited about more ambitious ideas like the DOE and EPA looking at pre-permitting carbon storage hubs, including in places where communities might opt into hosting those hubs. Second, we need continued robust R&D support. Over the past few years, Congress has passed really groundbreaking legislation, and it's helped secure American leadership on direct air capture. Continued funding can and should include a diverse portfolio of direct air capture pathways, supporting emerging technologies alongside those being deployed today. This can increase learnings, it can drive innovation, and prevent technology lock-in. DAC will also require additional clean energy. Coordination across DOE's applied offices can support research on key questions at the intersection of carbon removal and renewable energy. Finally, with a $35 million carbon dioxide removal procurement prize, the federal government can play a unique role in establishing high standards for direct air capture and other long-duration carbon removal pathways in ways that unlock additional private capital and increase public acceptance. Robust performance-based standards across a portfolio of durable carbon removal technologies and solutions will help drive the market towards quality and consistency, de-risking investment, crowding in private funding, and setting the stage for more robust policy support. Thank you again for the opportunity to testify, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you. Now we have Ms. Barkow.
Good morning, Chairman Manchin, Ranking Member Barrasso, and honorable members of the committee. I appreciate the opportunity to be with you here today. My name is Lily Barkow, and I'm the Groundwater Section Manager at the Water Quality Division at the Wyoming Department of Environmental Quality. The Groundwater Section oversees the implementation of the Underground Injection Control Program. Wyoming received primacy of the UIC program in 1983 for 5 classes of wells, and in September 2020, the department received primacy of Class 6 wells for permanent storage of the carbon dioxide. Our long history in implementing the UIC program demonstrates expertise and experience that is easily transferable to the Class 6 program. Wyoming began enacting legislation in 2008 to allow and promote CO2 storage. Within Wyoming's regulatory framework, prospective CO2 storage operators can pursue CCS in an environment with well-defined risks and liabilities. Wyoming is also well-suited geologically for CO2 storage due to the number of high storage potential sedimentary basins in the state. Because of these factors, Wyoming is poised for a successful deployment of CCS, and interest in CCS projects is high. Currently, 12 proposed Class 6 wells in Wyoming are in various stages of the permitting process, ranging from the pre-application stage to the permit issuance stage. The department anticipates issuing its first 3 Class 6 permits for well construction by the end of the calendar year. In order to help applicants meet the department's rules and expedite permitting of these Class 6 wells, the department has developed and is implementing a streamlined permitting process that encourages operators to meet with regulatory agencies early in that process. The department anticipates it will be able to issue a Class 6 permit authorizing injection within 1.5 to 2 years from the date it received the application. However, permitting timeline ultimately depends on the condition of the submitted permit application and the responsiveness of that applicant. Permitting for CO2 storage is only one facet of the CCS process. Other factors may pose obstacles for Class 6 permitting. CO2 storage on federal lands needs further consideration. Given the high concentration of federal lands located in Wyoming, large-scale CCS projects are almost certain to implicate federal holdings, generating questions about how federal land agencies, such as the Bureau of Land Management, will approach CCS and access to pore space in particular. Current federal law does not provide a legal definition of pore space, much less clarify the ownership of pore space in situations of split estates, where the surface rights are privately owned, but the mineral rights are federally owned. Therefore, clarification on pore space and unitization of that pore space is needed to support timely permitting of CCS projects. Furthermore, improved coordination between the department and Wyoming BLM is needed to ensure that Class 6 permit issuance and BLM right-of-way authorizations are issued at the appropriate times and such that each agency has the information it needs to make its decisions within its regulatory authorities. The Class 6 permit authorizes injections of CO2 such that underground sources of drinking water, or USDWs, are protected, whereas under the BLM right-of-way, the BLM is charged with ensuring access to federal pore space and that federal mineral estates are not damaged. It is important to keep these two roles and authorities distinct. Further, clarification on financial assurance through bonds for Class 6 permits on federal lands is needed to identify what portions of the CO2 storage site require bonding through the department and BLM. Avoiding duplication of bonding will be important to CCS projects financially. In addition to federal pore space just discussed, interstate pore space may pose an obstacle as well. Wyoming's sedimentary storage basins traverse or are situated near state borders. The CO2 storage site is defined as the CO2 plume, pressure front, and any displaced fluids, and is referred to as the area of review. The federal Class 6 program regulations do not consider pore space in the issuance of the permit and only require public notification to local, tribal, or neighboring states in the area of review. However, process for acquisition and storage in a neighboring state's pore space has not been identified, especially if that neighboring state does not have current regulations regarding pore space. Another topic of consideration is Class 6 regulations require that CO2 injection occur below the lowest most USDW and do not allow for new aquifer exemptions to be approved. Wyoming has deep formations that may be considered a USDW, but under other UIC well classes would be afforded an aquifer exemption in accordance with federal regulations. Not allowing aquifer exemptions for Class 6 may eliminate additional storage reservoirs. And finally, there is currently no federal funding being provided to states to implement Class 6 primacy programs. While under the Infrastructure Investments and Jobs Act, EPA is offering one-time grant funding to support states either with or seeking Class 6 primacy. However, long-term funding opportunities and grant requirements are not available. Thank you again for the opportunity to be here, and I will gladly answer any questions.
Thank you. I want to thank you all for your introductory statements. And now we're going to start with our questioning, and I'll begin with Mr. Piggott. This May, EPA proposed a new rule under the Clean Air Act to restrict carbon emissions from both new and existing coal and natural gas plants, largely using carbon capture. A typical Class 6 well can sequester around 1 megaton per year, depending on the geology. According to EPA's own greenhouse gas inventory, the U.S. power sector emits around 1,500 megatons of CO2 annually. Even if we want to capture 1/3 of that, that would be 500 Class 6 wells. So, as you know, the EPA has the permitting responsibility. Do you think they'll be able to permit enough wells to meet the demand created by these rules that has been proposed by you all?
Thank you, Senator Manchin. It's an important question, and it recognizes the importance of the Class 6 program to all of these projects. The Class 6 well application process is a linchpin to the success of these things. And we've been, thank you to you all, and through the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law and the Inflation Reduction Act, granted the funding to increase our staffing to ensure that we meet that demand. But also, I recognize, as we've heard from Lily, the importance of states in ensuring that we allow them to have primacy that's been granted for all of our permit programs, because states can operate efficiently and effectively to issue permits.
Let me add to that, so you can, when you're going into your final statement here, do you believe that carbon capture is cost effective?
I believe that carbon capture is the linchpin to ensuring that we use all the tools necessary to meet our climate goals, sir.
So you believe it can be done?
I believe we can accomplish this together, and through the funding provided by Congress. We've increased our staffing from 7 people to 34, and because of the Federal Permitting Improvement Steering Council, we've got more funds to direct for increased staffing at the same time that we award primacy, because of the good work that the folks
We've seen the surge of the demand. Basically, we're 169 wells that are basically still in permit process, waiting for kind of actions. And that depends an awful lot on, are we able to meet the demands that's going to be brought by the market conditions, and that's what we're concerned about. So I would say with additional funding that you have and DOE's role in this too, hopefully you are able to get up to speed. Let me just segue into that. Ms. Barku, a proven way to bring more resources to speed up Class 6 wells is allowing primacy. Primacy means that the states would have the responsibility. In Wyoming, you're one of the 2 states that successfully applied for a Class 6 primacy. And I can ask you 2 things. How has that affected? How long did it take you to get that? We've been trying since 2022 in West Virginia. because we have a lot of formations that'll work also. How long was your process in getting your permit, and how has it affected since you have primacy in your state?
Yes, so we've received, it took approximately 33 months to get through the entire primacy application process, from submitting that application in January of 2018 through receipt of that in September 2020. Since receiving primacy, we've held numerous informational meetings to work with operators on getting those permits issued, setting up the program to outline the exact needs so that we can streamline that permitting process. So it's very important for...
Took you about 2 years to get
Yes.
approval?
Yes, sir.
And now you're still, do you have any wells in activity right now? Any wells permitted in Wyoming?
We are about to issue three permits for construction. We don't have any to date that have been permitted.
How long would that take to put that in production? How long would it take for those to get in production once you permit them?
They will have to construct those wells. They're looking to possibly construct them starting in May, and then that will take several months. We'll have to do any kind of permit modifications to get through the authorization to inject, and then it should be within a year or two.
Ms. Burns, how important are the timely Class 6 well permits for your organization over kind of watching what we're doing with all this CO2? And we have a way to do it, and we want to do it, and we have the technology to do it. We just have to have the will to do it in a timely fashion. So what's yours?
Extremely important. I appreciate why a lot of the focus historically on things like direct air capture has been in bringing down the cost of the technology, which we need to continue to do. I think we also have a really strong track record at the Department of Energy being really good at bringing down the cost of new technologies, and I'm pretty ambitious. I'm pretty bullish on the opportunities to bring down the cost of things like direct air capture. What worries me more is the infrastructure. We're going to need to store billions of tons of carbon dioxide, and we need a robust and well-functioning Class 6 permitting process.
You all weighed in on that with the EPA and with the DOE and all of them, how important it is to get this done?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, okay. With that, Senator
Well,
Rosso.
thanks, Mr. Chairman. Let me start with Mr. Crabtree. Welcome back to the committee. This is a committee with diverse opinions, and you were confirmed unanimously by the committee and unanimously by the United States Senate, which shows there's a lot of faith in your ability to handle this problem. And, earlier this week, 2 offshore wind projects were officially scrapped. Story in the New York Times today, and Mr. Chairman, I asked to unanimously consent to put this in the record. It says, offshore wind firm cancels New Jersey projects as industry's prospects dim. It says a combination of high inflation, soaring interest rates, are making planned projects that looked like winners several years ago no longer profitable. This move will crimp the Biden administration's plans to make the wind industry a critical component of plans to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, which says to me it's even more critical to achieve the goals of the administration for carbon capture and sequestration to work. So if we're serious about reducing CO2, projects advancing this technology need to continue to move forward and in a brisk pace. In May of this year, the department announced it's going to award the University of Wyoming School of Energy Resources a grant under the Carbon Safe program. The project's going to play a critical role in expanding carbon dioxide transportation and storage infrastructure in the region. My understanding is that the department has not yet started negotiations with the university on this grant. It's been about 5 months. When do you expect the department to begin negotiations with the university on this grant?
Senator, just to clarify, is that the Sweetwater project?
Yeah.
Yeah. I actually had a conversation this week, coincidentally. My understanding, so let me take one step back to answer your question. There's about $2.5 billion in the infrastructure bill for the geologic storage program. We're implementing that through an expanded Carbon Safe, of which Sweetwater is many projects that have been approved. Our goal is to enable, with private sector investment and federal investment, 20 to 40 regional geologic storage sites over the 5-year lifespan of the funding from the infrastructure legislation. We need to make sure that we engage consistently with all the different projects and that we co-fund in a consistent way. I heard from one of your constituents concerned that this was taking too long. I have followed up, and the reason for the delay is the team is trying to make sure that in response to Wyoming's situation, we're treating Wyoming in the same way terms of number of wells, types of wells, that we are Pennsylvania or any other state. I was assured that they would be getting feedback shortly.
Because we do have a cowboy culture. We kind of get things done quickly, and that's an ability to do that in Wyoming. We don't think we ought to be held back because of delays in other states. So thank you. Thanks for your attention.
Well, and sir, I'm from North Dakota. I appreciate that.
Great. Ms. Barkow, if I could go to you on the Environmental Protection Agency granted the state the authority to permit the Class 6 wells in 2020. First state to receive the authority. How many applications is your agency currently working on? I know you said you had 3 that you're going to do the permits now.
We have 5 that are in-house that are under review, the 3 that are about to be issued, 1 that has been somewhat stagnant and deficient, and we'll be asked the applicant to reattempt the application, and 1 that's currently in discussions. We've received 5 additional ones for as a pre-application phase, and then there are the carbon safe projects up in the Dry Fork Station that will be converted from Class 1 to Class 6 in the near future, and a number of other permits submitted by them.
So do you believe that this authority that we have in Wyoming helps Wyoming stay on the cutting edge of carbon capture?
Absolutely. Basically, Wyoming knows Wyoming. So with us getting out there to issue these permits, do the reviews, we are protecting the underground sources of drinking water. We're able to streamline the process, work collaboratively with operators to move this forward. And so having the primacy of the program really helps us to work best with the operators for the state itself.
Okay, so, Mr. Crabtree, a rule that recently came out of the EPA requires coal plants to capture 90% of their carbon dioxide emissions. Under the Clean Air Act, the EPA can only rely on emissions reduction technologies that are, quote, adequately demonstrated. So can you name the commercial power plants that are currently and consistently achieving this 90% capture rate? Because I don't think there's one at all.
Well, actually, the Petronova, the project at the power plant in Houston, contrary, Senator, to all the criticism of the project that you see in the media, it's met all of its technical milestones. It was on time, it was on budget, and its capture rates were exactly what the Department of Energy was expecting. Now, as I think you know, the business model for that power plant was to store its CO2 through enhanced oil recovery. They did not claim the 45Q tax credit. They were an early adopter, so they were in a much more challenging commercial environment to do a second-of-a-kind project in the world. And so when COVID happened and everything collapsed in terms of the oil market, they took that project offline, but it is now back up and operating. And so it is very much a success story in terms of the application of retrofit technology to a thermal power plant.
Yeah, so it's not 90%. I mean, that's the concern, that the technology isn't there for broad distribution to really be at 90%, which is what the EPA, I think it's an unrealistic effort. But
I feel a need to defend the technology because we have environmental critics asserting that's not the case. What's important to bear in mind is that that project was designed to optimize its economic performance, given that it was a demonstration project. So it's not designed to capture all the CO2 from all the flue gas stream. It's a portion of that flue gas stream. But what's important is that it is achieving 90% or better from that flue gas stream that it was designed to capture. So it's actually a technical success in that regard and important to recognize.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Senator Heinrich.
Thank you, Chairman. Ms. Burns, how important are the 45Q tax subsidies in the Inflation Reduction Act to both carbon capture and direct air capture projects?
Thank you, Senator Heinrich. So the 45Q tax incentive for direct air capture to saline storage is $180 per ton, up from $50 per ton. That's really significant. It's based on an analysis out of 2019 from the Rhodium Group looking at really what value is needed. And the fact that Congress is able to take quick action in response to that was really helpful in the direct air capture sector, and in particular paired with things in the other pieces of the Inflation Reduction Act, the infrastructure bill, all of those pieces combined, robust R&D support. The Congress has been extremely responsive to needs identified through those analyses, through things like the National Academies report, and it's really spurred, again, even though some of the early direct air capture companies like Climeworks and Carbon Engineering came out of countries, not the U.S., we're still the global leader in direct air capture because of that policy support.
What would be the, as you know, there are a number of members of Congress who've called for the repeal of the Inflation Reduction Act. What would be the impact on the direct air capture and, for that matter, CCS projects in the pipeline right now were the Inflation Reduction Act to be repealed in its totality?
Yeah, I think it'd be, without any sort of formal analysis, pretty catastrophic. Again, the U.S., it's because of the federal policy support that the U.S. is seeing far more deployment in technologies like direct air capture and other durable carbon removal pathways. There's excitement about what other durable carbon removal pathways could be supported through things like tax incentives that are modeled after the success of the 45Q tax incentive. And so I think that would represent a sort of waving a white flag on American leadership on things like direct air capture.
The word you used was catastrophic, right?
Yes, sir.
Yeah. Mr. Pigott, you were asked by the chair about the economic viability of CCS and direct air capture projects. Setting aside enhanced oil recovery, and we've seen that that has a business case here, without 45Q, would any of these projects be economically viable at this stage in technology development?
Well, in the Class 6 program, our evaluation is not of the economics of the viability, but how quickly do we process and ensure that the projects that are put in place protect our sources of drinking water? And therefore, our economic analysis is not in regard to the viability. I'm sure that the incentives that have been provided through the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, the Inflation Reduction Act, and other funding sources such as the 45Q tax credit have provided an incentive, and therefore we've seen a dramatic increase in the interest in these Class 6 applications. And
Mr. Crabtree, why don't you answer that question then? Without the 45Q incentives, what percentage of the projects in the pipeline for both direct air capture and CCS would be economically viable today, do you believe?
Very few would be economically viable without a tax credit, as is the case with most clean energy technologies. That's the role that tax credits have historically played to accelerate innovation and ultimately deployment. I think, if I might, it's really important to distinguish, if you think about the full suite of technologies we need to meet our climate challenge and net zero emissions by 2050, carbon capture and storage as a family of technologies, including carbon removal, has historically received very little federal policy support compared to other clean energy technologies. That started to change in 2018 with the reform and expansion of 45Q. It has dramatically changed with the 2020 Energy Act, followed by the infrastructure legislation and the Inflation Reduction Act. Now, parity can be defined in many different ways, but we have broadly parity across a family of technologies that we need. And what's really misunderstood about costs for carbon management is it's the only set of technologies that are expected to justify themselves on a per-ton basis. But you can look at all the technologies we need from a climate standpoint in terms of what they cost on a per-ton basis. And what you'll find across that cost spectrum is whether it's carbon management or renewables or fuels or a whole range of technologies, they go from very, very inexpensive to very, very costly. So we have carbon capture projects that will move forward now under the 45Q tax credit, ethanol production, gas processing, hydrogen production, fertilizer production with just the tax credit, and it will be dozens of projects will be likely moving forward. But when you get to things like heavy industry, power generation, then we'll need the investments from the infrastructure bill to help de-risk.
If we repealed the IRA in its totality, what would happen to all those projects, Mr. Crabtree?
Well, all is many, but historically, I think if you look at 13 operating commercial scale projects, the reason there are only 13 is until very recently, those projects could only be financed because a whole wide range of optimal things came together: location, infrastructure, opportunity to store CO2 through enhanced oil recovery. That's a very limited universe. The nearly 200 projects that have been publicly announced would shrink dramatically to probably near nothing.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Senator. I just want to add to that. The whole purpose of these pieces of legislation is basically to mature proven technologies. And if we can mature them, the quicker we mature them, that we all benefit by them. So that was really what we see happening. And sometimes we get in our own way, and everyone has ideological beliefs that kind of slow things down, or they'd like to see things fail. We've never put the money towards carbon capture that we should have. We talked about it. We never did it. And now that we are doing it, it's going to basically rapidly change the face of how we provide energy, the type of energy we can provide to have dependability and reliability. With that, Senator Murkowski.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We don't want to see things fail. In fact, we feel we've got great, extraordinary opportunities up north. And as we think about carbon capture, utilization, and sequestration, direct air captures, I don't think there is a single climate model that exists that states that these technologies are not going to be needed in the future, and then, of course, dramatically scaled up. So I'm curious this morning to hear how Department of Energy is implementing these provisions, how we're getting funding out the door. And I'll start by expressing, Mr. Crabtree, my appreciation for the announcement that ASRC, in consortia with Repsol and Santos, was selected to receive funds for the feasibility of the direct air capture hubs up on the North Slope. We're excited about that. I also want to express my hope that the department will take a real hard look at the existing Alaska applications for the carbon capture large-scale pilot project up there as well. It's really exciting, and when you think about it, it can be so transformative. What this application would do is test the technology of these 7 Frame 5 gas turbine generation equipment units there at Prudhoe. But when you think about the potential to make a difference, this alone has the potential to address 35% of the state's emissions, not just of the emissions up there, 35%. And then again, once it's successful in demonstrating the replication of this technology, to then move that to 20 Frame 5 turbines, all located within a 5-mile perimeter there on the slope. So question for you this morning is when the department is looking to make determinations on these pilots, and I know that you're somewhat restricted in giving too much information, but just more holistically, when you're looking at these applications, how important is the ability of replication and for these projects to then be able to expand to address emission sources in nearby areas? Do you take that into account?
We do, Senator. And by the way, I just have to say I was as excited as you were to see the award on the North Slope. If you'd asked me a few years ago, would we have Native Alaskan and industry cooperation around a direct air capture project on the North Slope of Alaska, I would not have imagined that.
Super exciting.
It is very exciting. Obviously, you already acknowledged this. I can't speak to projects under consideration. But yes, replicability, it's actually inherent in the whole approach to demonstration. The idea is with the demonstration funding is that with the success of these projects, it will de-risk these projects and facilitate investment in future similar projects in the marketplace. And that's why it's so important that Congress provided, and you, Senator, played a role with the 2020 Energy Act in expanding the role, not just to R&D that DOE can play, but supporting commercial scale demonstration of these technologies.
And that's why I think we're so excited about the potential up there, because we are in this unique ecosystem, if you will, given the topography and the geography of the slope compared to other areas in the lower 48. You have an opportunity here where you can utilize both CCUS and direct air capture in a heavily concentrated and primarily industrialized area there between Prudhoe and Kuparuk. And so you have an amazing opportunity up there to demonstrate in a way that is unique, driven by, again, the topography and how things are concentrated. So we're very, very excited about it. You mentioned the recognition that we're working with Alaska Natives, ANCs, Alaska Native, Arctic Slope Native Corporation. I think you've been up to Alaska enough to know and understand the complexity of the institutions that are serving Alaska Native people. It's not just tribes, it's tribal consortia, it's the corporations. And I've heard from some applicants that there's a worry or a concern that there's this disconnect or perhaps a lack of appreciation or understanding for how ANCs work as part of the project, their place in the community, how the benefits actually flow back to shareholders. So I hope that you can give me some assurance that these applications aren't being discounted because of perhaps some within the system's lack of understanding about ANCs and how they operate.
I appreciate that question. I would suspect that there probably more broadly you encounter a lot of lack of understanding of Alaska Native corporations and the role that they play. Because we have our Arctic Energy Office, for example, on my first trip to Alaska, I was fully briefed. The team actually organized a dialogue for me with representatives of the corporations. I think a greater challenge, if I may, in Alaska right now, that I think my 2 visits and the subsequent follow-up of my team has helped, you and I talked about this in Anchorage, is that you have enormous opportunities in Alaska for regional initiatives, turning the Cook Inlet into a carbon hub, for example. Right. You've been mentioning the North Slope here. There's also the decarbonization of your regionally isolated grid.
Which we're really excited about.
And there's enormous opportunities there. But when the first trip I made, I sensed there was not an appreciation for the multiple provisions in the infrastructure legislation and the Inflation Reduction Act that could be layered together to do comprehensive projects. And my sense that's changing. And as from our DOE perspective, the Alaska Native corporations are fundamental to all of that.
Well, I look forward to working with you, and if you have identified some that we need to speak to just about how the whole system knits together up there, I'm happy to do that. These are exciting. Mr. Chairman, I really appreciate that you and the ranking member have put this before the committee today. I have a whole host of questions, not only for Mr. Crabtree, but Mr. Piggott, that I would like to ask be included as part for questions for the record.
Absolutely, and I think you might get another chance at this real quick. Senator King.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to inject, you'll pardon the term, another factor into this discussion, and that is time. We don't have time. There has to be a sense of urgency about this. We're in a race with climate change. We're seeing the impacts accelerating year by year by year. And Ms. Barco, you testified about the process to get to where you are today, and the well will be ready. My calculation was 7 years from the time it started in 2018. That can't be the standard, and I'm very disturbed by the chairman's chart of 169 applications, no approvals. This is, if the goal is protecting the environment, we've got to get on with it. We can't be delaying and slow walking the process in order to achieve our climate goals, whether it's CCUS or transmission lines or any other of the necessary infrastructure to achieve a green energy future. So I guess I want to start with Mr. Crabtree. Where are we on feasibility? And I think, and I'm an old alternative energy, renewable energy developer, I think in terms of cents per kilowatt hour. What are we talking about for CCUS when added to the cost of the output of a coal plant, for example?
That is so site-specific, but...
Give me a range, a ballpark. Are we talking 2 cents a kilowatt hour or 10 cents a kilowatt hour?
I would want to get back to you in a question for the record to show on that, but here's what I can say. For coal-fired power generation, the cost of carbon capture and storage is in the neighborhood of the 45Q tax credit. There's substantial commercial risk that increases the financing costs of projects. Some of the investments we're making that we've been talking about in CO2 transport and geologic storage will help to de-risk those commercial investments, because part of the challenge is that you're not just investing in the capital in the operations of the carbon capture equipment, you have that whole value chain of the CO2 transport and storage.
I'd appreciate if you could give me an answer on the numbers. In other words, will the cost of carbon capture equal the cost of producing the energy, or will it be more, will it be less? And that's a crucial factor, because again, one of the factors we're thinking about here is consumers what they got to pay for electricity. So I just would like that data, if you could. You don't need to answer now, but.
I definitely provide it for the record.
And Mr. Piggott, can we do this without damaging local communities? The objection is potential damage to local communities, water pollution. Again, not a detailed answer. I got my time is ticking away, but can it be done in an environmentally sound manner?
We believe, yes, it can, Senator, and very much appreciate the sense of urgency that you brought to this discussion. We believe it's urgent, too. That's why we're working to ensure and announce today the grant to ensure that states across the nation are able to put in place primacy applications. And we're willing to work with states, not only to provide them with the funding, but know on the front end what they should expect in order to process and receive primacy.
Ms. Barco testified it took almost 3 years to get your primacy designation. That's not acceptable. I mean, if it takes you 3 years to get to the starting point, and then the state has to do the permitting, and then there's a period for construction, there's got to be a process to accelerate that primacy determination.
Senator, we are working every day, and I agree with that sense of urgency to expedite our processes. There are important considerations to keep in mind. The federal programs are required to be mirrored by the states, so the legislation and the regulations have to mirror the federal regulation. So when we talk to states, and we have a 4-phase application process, one, as Ms. Barco mentioned, is the pre-application meeting, and one of the ways to speed that process up is to communicate up front what do we need from their legislature
Perhaps
and regulations.
you could produce a national template to all the states and say, here's the need, not make it one by one. I would remind you that Eisenhower retook Europe in 11 months.
Thank you for that reminder, sir, and we agree, which is why we recently put out guidance to our regions and to states to ensure that they know what needs to be embedded in their processes when they submit permit applications. And it's all on our website and available for all the states and individual applicants. But we're meeting with them in addition to that to ensure that they have all the tools on the front end and that things are expedited, not delayed because something's not ready.
And Mr. Crabtree, final in just the last few seconds. This is a necessary technology in order to achieve the climate goals, is it not? I looked at my ISO app a few minutes ago. 8% of our energy in New England is now coming from renewables, 8%. That means fossil fuels are going to be there for a while, and we've got to be able to deal with the carbon impact.
Yes, it is essential not only from a climate standpoint and for decarbonizing fossil fuels, but I would note that if you just look at industrial processes upon which modern life utterly depends, many of them, a majority of the emissions are unrelated to the energy inputs. The actual industrial process themselves produces CO2, and if you don't capture and manage that CO2, we cannot decarbonize cement, steel, chemicals. On those industries alone, we'll fail to meet our climate goals without economy-wide deployment of carbon management.
I would summarize my questions by the term, hurry up. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for holding the hearing today. Good to see you. All of you, thank you for being here and testifying today. Secretary Crabtree, particularly good to see you. Of course, our time from North Dakota working on these important issues, and appreciate that you're working on them now in your current role. Given that you're from North Dakota, you're aware of our projects. Obviously, the Danbury EOR project in Bowman County has been operating for quite some time. Dakota Gasification Company has been operating for, I think I turned the wheel on that for the carbon to go to the oil fields about 20 years ago. Yeah, well, I wasn't far off then. Red Trail Energy, Blue Flint now. So Red Trail's been operating for a while. Now Blue Flint has just added. Dakota Gasification Company now, in addition to their EOR, they're now adding sequestration. I think that they're getting very close. That will be the largest carbon capture project in the world when they've completed the next phase, and they will be capturing up to 85% of the CO2 they produce at that point. Project Tundra is moving forward. conventional coal-fired electric plant adding CO2 capture. That one being a rural electric cooperative owned, and of course Coal Creek, an investor owned conventional plant, also working to do the same thing. And undoubtedly you're aware of the Marathon Renewable Diesel Refinery project, which was part of the hydrogen hub for our area. Probably a $2.5 billion project for carbon capture, fertilizer production, and so forth on a renewable refinery that we have in western North Dakota. So, as the ranking member said earlier, North Dakota and Wyoming, 2 states with primacy. Obviously, that primacy is very important in terms of getting projects going. And I would encourage both you and Secretary Piggott to, work with more states to get the ability to get primacy. I mean, that's one way I think. I know you've been hearing it, and rightfully so, that you need to get these projects going. One way to help yourself is to get more states primacy, I believe, is a solution to get this done. You just get, it's like, just get a lot more hands on deck. And so I'm going to come to you in a minute and ask you, Secretary Piggott, about what you think can happen there to get more states primacy. We welcome the competition. But specifically, Secretary Crabtree, for you, and you know what's coming here, the regional partnerships. We could not be doing all these things without the work of the EERC at the University of North Dakota, Energy and Environmental Research Center at the University of North Dakota, which is the manager of the hydrogen hub for our region, almost $1 billion. And they'll do a tremendous job. But their partnerships, the regional carbon sequestration partnership that we have with the outstanding University of Wyoming, the Cowboys, but also my partner just left, but Alaska as well. We need those regional partnerships to be funded, and we work very hard to appropriate funds to do that. I'm also on the Appropriations Committee, and as is our chairman, and the chairman and I recently sent a letter, and we want to know when the FOIAs are going to go out and when we're going to get that funding for 23 for those regional partnerships. And I hope, Mr. Chairman, you will agree with me, it is an absolute priority that get done, and that outstanding partnerships like ours, and West Virginia has one too, are able to continue their good work. Would you agree with that, Mr. Chairman? I'd like that to be on the record, if you would. Secretary Crabtree. I didn't surprise you, did I, with this question?
Didn't surprise me, and let me just say
kind of a question and a bit of a statement. Yeah, both.
Yeah. Very excited about the projects in North Dakota. You recall many years ago when I used to harass you as a governor about things we could do to encourage exactly these kinds of developments. So it's taken too long, but it's very exciting. With respect to the regional partnerships, I agree with you about their importance. As far as the funding, the NOI is out. The funding opportunity announcement will be out this year, and we will work to expedite its implementation once it's announced. That was a commitment we made to you and your staff and the committee, and we will honor that. As you know, things were challenging on the committee. There were different views at the member level. We did not have four corners agreement.
There certainly were.
It strikes me from what I'm seeing, kind of reading the tea leaves, that maybe there is a coalescing on the committee.
Good.
So, as I've always told you, we have our own point of view about these things, but we will implement congressional direction, and we will gladly do it. That's our commitment to you. I guess what I would want to emphasize, though, and you were a lead sponsor of the SCALE Act, is what we're doing with the regional initiatives is now using them to drive commercial deployment of geologic storage, which is now fully commercial. And the $2.5 billion from the infrastructure bill, organizations like ERC are extremely well positioned to lead that technical assistance effort. And so that's what we're doing in our funding opportunity announcement. It's all about building facts on the ground, real projects, real storage. We'll complement that with the CO2 pipeline infrastructure through CFIA and all the other things that you supported prior to the infrastructure legislation. And so this can be a tool to see these results in project development on the ground.
This is really happening now. you know?
It is.
You know, you and I talked about this 20 years ago, and now it's really happening. And so you're helping.
We're both a little older, Senator.
A little bit, yeah, a little lighter hair color and all, particularly me. But this, you know, your work here is really important that we get this out there, so.
Well, I feel the urgency of it every
Good.
day. I agree with what Senator King said about the
And, Mr. Chairman, I know I'm over my
Senator
time.
Hawley, he'll,
Oh,
you'll give him a few.
Senator Hawley, will you hold for a minute? What about getting more states primacy, Secretary Piggott?
Senator, we agree with the approach that we need all hands on deck.
So you're pushing for that?
Absolutely. In fact, today we're announcing the availability of that $50 million that you all authorized us to grant to states to assist in that primacy process, and we are totally on board. And we're going to get that money out so that states can get primacy, and we work together to issue these permits.
Well, that's good, because the chairman has kind of a temper. Don't tell anybody.
No, we have one been waiting for, we're just about there, hopefully. We're close, right?
That's correct, sir.
Close.
Thank you. Thanks, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Hawley.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thanks to the witnesses for being here. Mr. Piggott, I'm going to address my comments to you, and what I'm about to talk about will probably come as no surprise to you. It's not with, I want to acknowledge at the start, it's not within your remit at EPA, but I want you to carry back to your colleagues at EPA my seriousness about this issue and my consternation about it. And I'm talking about the radioactive nuclear contamination in the state of Missouri, and in particular in the St. Louis and St. Charles areas. This dates back to the Manhattan Project, when St. Louis was used as a processing site for uranium. Proudly did their duty. The residents of St. Louis contributed to that important project, but when it was over, the federal government didn't dispose of the waste. They left it for the people of St. Louis to deal with. Worse than that, they negligently attempted to dispose of it themselves, the government did, and what it ended up doing was a whole bunch of it ran off. It was left in oil tankers, drums. There's photos of this that just sat in an open parking lot for years. The runoff went into a creek called Coldwater Creek, North County, St. Louis, where many, many homes were at the time and still are. Generations of kids grew up playing in that creek. Now many, many of them have cancer, autoimmune diseases, you name it. Then a whole nother batch of it was put into a landfill, and that's what I want to bring to your attention because the EPA has jurisdiction over it. It's the Westlake Landfill in Bridgeton, Missouri. That's just right outside of St. Louis. And there, for years now, that landfill has been sitting there with nuclear radioactive material underground, not cleaned up. State of Missouri can't do anything about it because you've got jurisdiction. And now there's a subterranean fire that is burning. I mean, you cannot make this stuff up. There's a subterranean fire that is burning in the landfill that threatens to ignite the nuclear material. Meanwhile, the material in the landfill is very close to the water sources, to the water table. Now, this has been going on. When I say years, I don't just mean for a few months, I mean for decades now this has been going on. For decades, and it's not cleaned up at all. In 2018, this has been a Superfund site, could I just say for the record, since 1990.
No objection.
So in 2018, the EPA finally said, well, they come up with a plan for remediation and it'd take 4 years to remediate. 2018. This is 2023. So far, no remediation has been done. The latest thing the EPA said is, well, maybe they'd announce a remediation schedule to begin in 2024. But then in March of this year, the EPA announced that the contamination was worse than they thought, which the residents have been saying for years, and now they cannot provide a timeline for cleanup. I mean, this is unbelievable, which has led to my push, which I'm proud to say has passed the Senate, to make sure that every resident in the St. Louis and St. Charles region who has been exposed to this nuclear contamination from their own government has their medical bills paid for. That is the only fair and just thing to do. Glad to say it passed the Senate. I hope it'll soon pass the House. But here's the deal. I need the EPA to get moving on this and clean this up. A Superfund site since 1990, and there's still nothing being done. EPA sent me a response letter on August 24th of this year, in which they said they still don't have a timeline for remediation. The letter reads in part, once the EPA approves the remedial design and there is an enforceable legal agreement in place with the responsible parties, then the remedial actions process can begin. Oh my gosh. So, Mr. Piggott, I need you to communicate once again to your colleagues at the EPA that this is, people are dying. This is not an acceptable situation. It hasn't been acceptable for decades. And I'll just make one other point here, and that is, it's probably no coincidence that the folks who live in this area are not big-time donors to political parties. They're not big-time party activists. These are working people. And they have been taken advantage of for years. And the government for years has just expected them to live with it. And when they said over and over and over, this contamination is bad, this contamination is spreading, there's a ground fire in the landfill, they were told, just shut up and live with it. And they are dying in record numbers. You go look at the cancer rates in the St. Louis region, you'll find them off the charts. You go look at breast cancer for women in particular in the St. Louis region, you'll find it is the leading center of it in the nation. In the nation. This has got to stop. And we need the EPA to clean this site up. That's my message. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator, and I promise I will deliver your message directly back to us at headquarters to ensure that everyone's aware of the concerns that you raised. As a widow of a spouse that passed from breast cancer, I certainly understand the concern with which you raise these issues, and I promise I'll deliver this message.
Senator Hickenlooper. Just in time.
Jeez. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank all of you for being here, for your service, all your hard work. Mr. Crabtree, I'll start with you. I share the view that the International Energy Agency and others, that view that we need to increase our carbon capture, our storage capabilities to stay on track for zero emissions by 2050. We think of this in our offices as a great transition, and it's part of artificial intelligence. I mean, all the technology that's changing is part of this energy transition as well, as different as they seem to be sometimes. I think what we've been lacking in the energy great transition is a business plan, where we look at all the various risks and opportunities, try to be able to map out specific priorities and why this priority over that priority. And I think that's part of, we need to get the private sector fully engaged. DOE is using funds from the bipartisan infrastructure law to look at productive uses for carbon, including those uses that can create revenue and hopefully generate long-term success. So can you describe a little bit more of Department of Energy's carbon utilization programs and how they can help achieve long-term economic vitality in this arena?
Senator, thanks for the question. Good to see you again. I actually really, everyone says appreciate the question, but I appreciate this question because carbon conversion hasn't actually received the attention it deserves. Part of it, I think, is that there's a lot of different technologies and potential business models. It's a much broader and more diverse and complex field than, say, capturing CO2 from even the industrial sector, especially from power plants. And it's also, relatively speaking, newer. And so if you look at the infrastructure bill was important because it actually doubled our office's funding for carbon conversion from $50 million a year to roughly $100. But if you look at the relative investments across a carbon management portfolio and in the infrastructure bill, it's still a very small part of the larger puzzle. We think it could be quite a bit bigger. In terms of thinking about some of the pathways, first of all, it's not just CO2, it's also carbon monoxide that comes out of industrial processes, steel production in particular, before it then becomes, it's combusted, it becomes CO2. And so we're going to be providing support to things like the development of building materials from waste carbon emissions. There's a lot of attention, of course, to taking cement and then, of course, making concrete and curing, having CO2 in that curing process. Also substitutes for the Portland cement, which is very CO2 intensive to produce. Those are all opportunities. We're also seeing lots of opportunities for mineralization in the production of products taking captured carbon emissions. I'm also very excited about biological pathways, but not the way most people would think. For example, taking carbon monoxide, in effect feeding that to microorganisms and then producing energy and products through those microorganisms. The other thing that's exciting about carbon conversion is in some industrial contexts, you can avoid combustion altogether, so there's environmental benefits beyond reducing carbon emissions.
I've got to cut you off. You can
sorry.
Have add written answers or remarks as well. I do want to get a question to Mrs. Is it Barkow or Barkow? Barkow. The U.S. Geological Survey. I bored most of you one time or another with the fact that I am an ex-geologist. So the U.S. Geological Survey was my home base for a part of my life. They've estimated that as many as 130 million acres of federal land have carbon storage potential. And that includes large basins in western states like Colorado. There can be complex ownership issues, some mix of federal, state lands, private ownership, places where the surface, many places in the West where the surface ownership is different than the mineral rights. Sometimes those mineral rights are federally owned. And so it makes it tricky to decipher who owns the pore space, that empty space between the grains once the oil is taken out, where carbon would be injected. How does this ambiguity surrounding pore space on federal lands hamper carbon capture sequestration permitting, and what can we do, what can Congress do to provide clarity?
Yes, it's certainly an issue that's in Wyoming. Our southwest corner of the state is a checkerboard pattern consisting of state or private lands mixed with federal lands.
Those old railroads.
Yep, exactly. And it is a problem, not understanding how to correlate the right-of-way authorizations with the Class 6 permitting. And financial assurance will play part of that. The split estate is certainly an issue that we're currently seeing with some of our permits where it's a private surface owner, and so in Wyoming, the surface owner is the pore space owner. But there's federal minerals there, and what exactly their role will be when it comes to the right-of-ways and the Class 6 permitting, and receipt of comments from BLM for this particular situation. There needs to be further guidance on how the roles and responsibilities of the different agencies, whether it's a state with primacy or EPA, for that Class 6 permitting, and the BLM, so that there's not duplication of efforts during the review process is really needed.
Duplication of efforts not in government. I can't imagine that. Anyway, I have more questions. I will submit them in writing, and I appreciate all of your being here. I yield back to the chair.
Senator Daines.
Chairman, thank you. Ranking Member Barrasso, thank you as well. Since taking office, the Biden administration has promulgated rule after rule attacking Montana oil, Montana gas, Montana coal. At this moment in history, as we're watching what's happening in the Middle East, the world unraveling, whether it's what's happened with Putin invading Ukraine and natural gas, whether what's seen with the Biden administration releasing sanctions on Iranian oil, at the same time shutting down Alaskan oil, shutting down the Keystone Pipeline, shutting down oil and gas production wherever they can. It's insane, and it ties right back to national security. I don't know why this administration is not trying to do all it can to produce more made American energy, coal, oil, natural gas. We've got anti-coal EPA regulations like MATS and the Clean Power Plan 2.0. This administration is doing everything they can to kill jobs and make my home state of Montana an energy importer rather than the energy hub it has been and continue to be if the administration left their hands off our state. We should be able to come together to promote carbon capture technology, to reduce carbon emissions, to maintain a stable grid, to build jobs. But instead, this administration is focused on an ideology that's become a religion focused on regulate first, ask questions later. Mr. Pigott, the EPA has proposed rules like MATS and Clean Power Plan 2.0 that seem to be directly focused on shutting down the Colstrip power plant in Montana. Both rules appear to give an ultimatum: install prohibitively expensive capture technology in a very short time period or shut down. Neither rule gives coal plants like Colstrip the time or the money to meet these prohibitive standards. Instead, they set unattainable requirements in hopes that Colstrip will be forced to shut down. Instead of over-regulating, we should be focused on innovation, making carbon capture technology affordable for coal plants to install to meet these carbon reduction goals. Mr. Pigott, why is the EPA charging forward with these impossible-to-meet standards before technology like CCUS is widely commercialized and affordable?
Senator Daines, thank you for the question. I will say the issues of air quality regulations are not within my wheelhouse, so I'm not prepared to answer the questions about where we are or the impact of those. But what is in my wheelhouse is the carbon capture permitting program, the Class 6 program, and we are committed to ensure that we put in place the resources, which is why we're announcing today that we're getting the $50 million that you in Congress have allocated to states to assume primacy, because we believe states are critical partners in ensuring that we get these Class 6 programs off the ground and running. And we are fully committed to doing so and doing it correctly.
But we can't, it's a noble statement, but it's unattainable based on the timelines that have been set here. I mean, it's the technology's not ready for prime time. And I recognize maybe you're not in that specifically at the EPA, but please help us here. Because you're talking out two sides of the mouth. And they're saying we want this technology to reduce carbon, but we're not going to allow the technology time to mature. I'm a chemical engineer by degree. I'm big in innovation, love the idea that we continue to make coal an important part of our energy future, because it will be as we look long-term, because the sun doesn't always shine and the wind doesn't always blow. I'm not opposed to renewable energy, it's just we need to expand our portfolio when the world's going to need 50% more energy in the next 25 years than we use today. So in other words, you have to take our portfolio and go like this over the course of the next 25 years, not like this.
Senator, I come from Indiana, where for 20 years I worked at the Indiana Department of Environmental Management. As you probably know, it's a coal state. Mm-hmm. So I'm well aware of the concerns about providing reliable energy, and I'm committed to ensuring that we put in place an effective Class 6 program that issues permits in a timely manner. And I'm happy to communicate with our folks in the Office of Air Quality the concerns that you've had.
Maybe they'll watch the hearing and they'll hear it directly as well. It would be helpful. It's deaf ears right now. I don't think they want to hear it. I really don't. I've been around, watched this long enough to see they really want to see these plants shut down. They think it's a noble cause. It's part of their belief they're doing the right thing here for everybody in doing so. Assistant Secretary Crabtree, the Department of Energy plays an important role in ensuring grid reliability. Is the department reviewing the EPA rules and the drastic effect they have on the reliability of the grid in places like Montana and the rest of the country?
Senator, yes, as you know, we're not the regulator here, but we do provide technical input on the regulations with respect to reliability. I would urge a more optimistic perspective on the technology as someone who has been an advocate for carbon capture for over 2 decades now, in the timeframes that are in the legislation, or I'm sorry, in the regulation, and what we're doing with respect to the build-out of...
With all due respect, are they talking to the folks right now, the engineers, the project managers who are in charge of delivering this? That's the problem. I mean, there's a major disconnect here in terms of probably the time I think it's realistically going to take versus the EPA mandates that are coming out. And it's an existential threat to our operations in Montana. And grid reliability is really important. If you don't have base load power, you don't have grid reliability, as you know.
Well, and that's why I think carbon capture is so important, because it allows us to decarbonize power generation and have that 24/7 dispatchable power. And I'm very optimistic about, I'm working with companies that are literally have projects over the next decade where they hope to manage a significant portion of their emissions.
Have you meshed that with the EPA mandates that are coming down to make sure there's enough room to get both accomplished? Have you looked at that in detail?
Well, our technical team has, yes.
Okay. I'm out of time. Thank you.
I'm going to have to go vote, and then Senator Padilla is going to have his questions, and then he has Senator Cassidy. He'll be chairing the remainder of this meeting. But thank you all so much. It's been grateful, great influence from all of us and great input from you all. We understand how important this is, and the bottom line is we need an all-of-the-above energy policy, and we need to do everything we can to make sure all of the energy that we have is done in the cleanest fashion. I think we can lead the world in that. And elimination is not going to cure the problem, but innovation can cure the problem, and I think that's what we're striving for. So with that, turn it over to Senator Padilla.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
You're now the chair.
Thank you myself. So proud that California remains committed to leading the nation in the innovation that Senator Manchin just spoke of and working to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions. As part of that broad portfolio, there's currently 11 geologic carbon sequestration proposals in California undergoing review for a Class 6 underground injection control permits at EPA. I'm also pleased to hear that the administration is carefully considering environmental justice concerns when reviewing these projects and applications. While these technologies have the potential to address disproportionate rates of illness experienced by vulnerable communities due to air pollution, we're mindful enough that we recognize it's vital that these new technologies do not inadvertently harm communities in other ways, including through harmful contamination of groundwater basins that provide drinking water to communities. Question for Mr. Pigott. You mentioned in your testimony that the EPA has a responsibility to ensure that carbon capture and storage technologies do not contaminate drinking water. Can you elaborate for a minute on how specifically the EPA is planning to ensure these projects do not have those adverse impacts?
Thank you, Senator Padilla. Yes, I can. I know that the geological formations in the ground are very important for us to consider as we look to ensure that we put these carbon wells in the right places. We examine the geology to ensure that the area is free of fractures and faults. We look at the injected CO2 plume. Where's it expected to go, and what is the likelihood that it could spread? And then we look at the specifics of the well construction itself to ensure that the well is constructed in such a way as to operate properly. But it doesn't stop there, and it doesn't stop with just the issuance of a permit. Long after a well is closed, we ensure that there are requirements in the permits for the permittees to monitor and to put in place and have financial insurance in place, corrective action plans in the event that something unexpected happens. So there are several technical aspects that we embed within our approval of our permits. In addition to that, our job being to secure that people are fully protected from adverse environmental consequences, have taken several steps over this past year to ensure that communities are involved and aware of that process. These common sense practices set out clear expectations for communities and for the project proponents so that everybody knows what the expectations are. So there's a thorough analysis of where these wells are sited, but there's a thorough participation by the communities to ensure everyone's aware and assured of the functional ability of these projects, Senator.
Yeah, well, I'm pleased to hear about the consideration, not just during the application and approval process, but ongoing. It's a very different type of facility, but you're speaking to a senator who lives in the shadow of the Aliso Canyon gas storage facility in Southern California, which was the source of the largest methane gas leak, I believe, in our nation's history just a couple of years ago due to its aging and not sufficiently maintained, obviously, wells and other infrastructure. On a different topic, I know 45Q has been discussed a good amount earlier in the hearing, but I have a question with a slightly different angle to it. In 2020, the International Energy Agency published a report examining the role for carbon capture in the clean energy transition, noting that it would be virtually impossible to reach net zero without carbon capture utilization and sequestration and direct air capture technology. Now, some innovators in California and around the country are going even further and making products like cement with lower or even zero emissions. However, the 45Q tax credit only applies to companies that emit and then capture their emissions, but not companies that are directly lowering or eliminating emissions altogether. Questions for Mr. Crabtree. How should we think about balancing current incentives for carbon capture versus rewarding innovation or innovative technologies for low or reduced emissions?
Thank you, Senator. So you've identified, obviously, what needs to be a top priority, which is if you can avoid the emissions in the first place, then you should do that. And so I would note that outside the context of carbon management, fortunately, the infrastructure bill is comprehensive, as are the tax credits in the Inflation Reduction Act. So you mentioned the 45Q tax credit, but there's like 48C tax credit. There are other tax credits that are focused on decarbonization as well as funding provisions in the infrastructure bill. One I would note that gets to, I think, your concern is being implemented by the Office of Clean Energy Demonstrations, and that's the industrial decarbonization provision. It's a $6 billion provision in the infrastructure bill, and it allows for carbon capture, but it also funds things like advanced energy efficiency in industrial settings, electrifying different heating processes. One of the major demands of energy and sources of emissions in the industrial sector is heat. And so to the extent that we can electrify that heat, we're obviously avoiding emissions, assuming the electricity is decarbonized. And then there's just a range of, the role of hydrogen is also can be brought into industry to avoid emissions in the first place. So that's I think, a critical area where we can make progress and avoid emissions in the first place.
Ms. Burns, would you have anything else to add?
Thank you, Senator. I would say what Brad said on we need to reduce where we can reduce is incredibly important. And I would say also, you touched on the role of California. I will say Carbon 180 started out of California. We were proudly headquartered there until very recently. We're also a part of one of the direct air capture hubs projects, the Community Alliance for Direct Air Capture in the Central Valley. And I think we're particularly excited about the role that California has played in leading the nation on things like direct air capture, including the plant that's going to be unveiled next week in Tracy, California, led by Heirloom. And so I think looking holistically at the innovation that we can support in the state and across the country is really essential.
Thank you. Well, flattery will get you very far.
Wonderful.
And just a final note before recognizing Senator Cassidy, I think the longer term question here is as new technologies come, want to make sure that we're keeping up with our incentive structure that reflects new technologies that will not necessarily always fit into the categories as we've structured them initially. Senator Cassidy.
Thank you. Mr. Pico, Louisiana is seeking to get primacy for Class 6 wells. I mean, this is like a year overdue. I think literally maybe 2 years overdue. It's just amazing. And we're told, the governor and I were on the phone with Mr. Regan not long ago, or I guess it was a long time ago, maybe 8 months, maybe 6 months, in which it was intimated we were about to receive. We still haven't received. What's the holdup? Louisiana apparently is a model for many aspects of the application, and we still haven't received. Can you tell me why not?
Senator Cassidy, first I want to say I appreciate your concern about the primacy process and the number of applications that are currently under review. I share that concern, and we're working hard to provide that process. And we're following the rule process that we've articulated, which is we've public noticed the rule, and now we've got 66,000 comments, and we'll be responding to each and every comment.
But you reopened the public. Do I recall that you reopened the public? I mean, you'd done it, you completed that, and then you reopened it? Excuse my frustration, but I mean, I get the intent, I get the impression you don't want to give us primacy.
Sir, we are fully committed to this primacy pact.
And why did you reopen?
Louisiana. We reopened it because Louisiana submitted additional documentation to us regarding the application, and we wanted to make sure.
That must be something that was solicited, because as far as the governor was concerned, we were about to announce that we were going to receive it, and boom, it's reopened. So I'm thinking that there may have been something like we need to hear from you guys again.
There was a change in the statutory provisions in Louisiana that Louisiana submitted to us, and in order to make sure that the primacy for Louisiana was fully defensible, we've public noticed that, and we are did it for an additional.
Can I ask?
30
My
days.
staff tells me that what said that? The filing said that no changes were needed because the application addressed the changes in the law. So I'm hearing that that I'm getting mixed messages here. I'm getting a sense that I'm hearing an excuse as opposed to that which was actually offered. And I don't mean to be kind of like obnoxious about it, but how long does it take EPA, if you don't have, the state doesn't have primacy, how long does it take the EPA to permit on average a Class 6 well?
The permitting process takes approximately 2 years, sir.
So, okay, so Louisiana has a direct air capture. We're trying to sequester carbon. We're trying to achieve the goals that have been laid out there. And we've met all the goals, and I'm told that your filing said that we had accommodated our change in law by our application, but instead it's been reopened. Tell me why I shouldn't be incredibly frustrated with EPA.
We are interested in ensuring that the primacy application is fully defensible, and now we're past the public comment period. We received 66,000.
And how long will it take to review those 66,000?
We're in the end stages of this process.
So in stages, I used to talk to medical students, and they would say about 2. Can you tell me what in stages mean? Is it a week? Is it 2 weeks? Because it's been 2 years. So is it a month? Can you give me a time frame?
Senator, I certainly appreciate the frustration that you have with the process, and we're all very interested.
Now, can you just tell me what's the time frame? Because I have limited time.
We're hoping in the near future.
The near future doesn't mean anything to me. Is it a month? Is it 2 months? Is it a week?
We will continue to ensure
that is a non-answer, and you know it. Can you give me a month?
Senator, we're committed, fully committed to issuing primacy for Louisiana, and I want to make sure that—
I hear you say that, but I see no evidence of it. No evidence whatsoever, and you won't give me a straight answer.
Senator, we've finished the process except for the part where we're responding to all the public comments, which is required in that
If you got
process.
66,000 of them, how long does it take you to respond to 66,000 comments?
Well, we've been working to do that, and we'll continue to work on it.
I'm sorry, I apologize. I have to move on because I'm not
Yes,
getting an
sir.
answer, and you know I'm not getting an answer. Mr. Crabtree, another bit of frustration. The Louisiana had a hydrogen hub application, which made all the sense in the world to me. We had the pipelines. We actually had the guaranteed offtake of the hydrogen we were going to make. And we have the Mississippi River, which allows us to ship it around the world. Looked pretty good to me. But it turns out only one hub was approved on the Gulf Coast, even though we have the infrastructure, we have the natural gas, we have the transportation. A bunch were in the Northeast, which is quite remarkable to me, since they don't have typically the advantages we do. And yet then I heard that the merit reviewers paid by DOE to judge applications in some cases did not ask questions or comment upon Louisiana's application. And DOE did nothing about that. Then we were told last week that there was no standardized way by which the questions were supposed to be formed of these applications. There's not a uniform sending of questions or clarifications of any of the 28 hydrogen hub applications. Now, heck, I couldn't help but notice that a lot of the hydrogen hub places were blue states. Then I heard a rumor that they were just trying to spread the love, as opposed to going where there's increased merit. So knowing that I'm frustrated by all this, tell me why I should believe in this process when some of the reviewers didn't even comment or ask questions on the Louisiana application.
Senator, so I was involved in my capacity as Assistant Secretary of the Office of Fossil Energy and Carbon Management, as many of my colleagues heading other offices were, in the development of the funding opportunity announcement for the hydrogen hubs. And we routinely do that with different provisions in the infrastructure bill. But at the point at which it was announced as a solicitation, a funding opportunity announcement, my involvement in the hydrogen hubs process ceased. And as you know, a merit review process of federal civil servants takes over. And even in those funding opportunity announcements that are the province of FECM, the office I oversee, once the FOA is released, I am not personally involved as a political appointee. I'm not trying to dodge your question. I actually watched the hearing. I understand your concerns and all the arguments you laid out. It's, and my understanding is that there's a process in place to follow up with the office that's responsible for.
So far, we've not heard from them.
Okay, well, I can take that back, that concern, but my understanding is that you would have the opportunity to address your concerns. The one thing I would like to address, just as someone who is deeply committed to the bipartisan implementation of the bipartisan infrastructure law, we make every possible effort we can to implement these provisions equitably, fairly. And I recognize your support and other members from both political parties for that legislation and how profoundly important it is that all regions of the country benefit. And I think if you look across the implementation of the infrastructure provisions, states like my own of North Dakota, yours, and others who are deeply red states are very competitive in receiving significant funding and in other areas.
I accept that, but the goal of it was not necessarily to give some to California because California has not received enough. It was to go where you're going to achieve the goals of the legislation, which is to remove carbon from the atmosphere or otherwise create more or lower carbon intensity products. That was actually the goal. And so it should be upon merit, not upon let's make sure everybody gets a little piece of the pie. But whenever the federal government does that, we lose effectiveness. So I'm way over time, and I got to go vote. But
so, Senator Cassidy, I wasn't speaking to the hydrogen provision. I was speaking more generally to our commitment
I agree with
to
that.
bipartisan implementation.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Cassidy. I will take a minute to thank again all of our witnesses for joining us this morning and for such a robust discussion. Announcement for members and their staff. Members will have until close of business tomorrow to submit additional questions for the record. And with that, this committee stands adjourned.